All over the world, human beings clearly go to great lengths to ensure that the dead are buried in a respectful manner. But on the other hand, throughout history, people also took steps to determine whether or not someone was actually ready to be laid to rest, in order to prevent people from being buried alive.
The fear of being buried alive. It was a fairly common fear up until 20th century medical practices meant fewer people were in fact buried alive. It was most common in 18th and 19th century Europe and America. Mostly due to the medical practices and the burial practices at the time. This was when medical diagnoses could get things wrong. And people were, in fact, buried alive, and stories of that became sensationalized, and therefore the panic would spread.
In the 19th century, the great fear of being buried alive was partly because this was the age of cholera. Cholera causes severe diarrhea, which can deplete all the electrolytes in your body, and in extreme cases can induce a coma. So sometimes people appear dead, and they're actually in this sort of vegetative state, and they can come out of it. But if you bury them, then you've buried them alive, and that is a terrible death.
Historically, the thought of being trapped in a wooden box beneath thousands of pounds of dirt with no possibility of escape was so widespread that this fear was actually given a name. It's called taphophobia.
Taphophobia is the idea of simply just the fear of being buried alive. Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote about premature burial, was terrified of being buried alive. Frédéric Chopin, the composer, wanted to be stabbed in the heart and bled out to make sure that he was dead when doctors believed that he was. And even George Washington was so afraid of being buried alive that he had written in his will that his body had to remain in bed for 3 days after they thought he was dead to make sure that he didn't come back.
It was estimated by the 1890s that some 2% of people being buried were buried alive. Now, this is a gross exaggeration, no doubt, but it was believed at the time, enough so that organizations like the London Association for the Prevention of Premature Burial was founded in 1896, and they lobbied Parliament for greater diligence on the part of doctors to make sure that doctors were verifying death.
Despite doctors' best efforts, it was simply difficult at the time to determine whether a person was alive or dead. And so in order to ease people's minds, authorities in Europe were forced to take drastic measures. Vienna, Austria. Within this storied city lies the Vienna Central Cemetery, the second largest cemetery in the entire world. In the heart of the cemetery stands a small building that today houses a museum. But in the 19th century, it was referred to as a Leichenhaus.
The Leichenhaus was a kind of mortuary where corpses were kept for a period, typically about 3 days, and watched over by attendants to make sure that a person was truly dead and wouldn't be buried alive in a state of coma or catalepsy.
Those who worked at the Leichenhaus, the undertakers mainly, could ensure that people are not being buried alive. They had several measures they could use, for example, a hard step knife. And there was basically a treatment that you could order by doctors. And then one doctor had the possibility, the option, and the privilege to step the knife into your heart to make sure that you're not going to be buried alive.